I don't think that many doctors get this, is that energy delivery mechanisms are at the root of all pathological conditions, almost without exception. They are vital in preventing and reversing dementia, preventing and treating cancer, preventing and treating heart disease as well. If you produce energy anaerobically to generate lactic acid, you get 2 molecules of ATP. If you do it aerobically via mitochondria, from 1 molecule of acetate, you get 36 molecules of ATP. So it's much more efficiently burning stuff aerobically. Lactic acid inhibits mitochondria and eventually you crash down, you keel over. Those are the 5 supplements that I routinely recommend for anybody with a pathological fatigue. Take the mitochondrial package. I'd probably add in creatine as well, because that is a proven benefit for improving mitochondrial function and therefore bigger muscles. So energy is everything. Energy is the difference between life and death. It is vital.
Sarah, one of your favorite areas to talk about is fatigue. And right off the bat, let's jump in that subject, go deep. But what I'm curious, how does that clinical picture differ from somebody just burning the candle at both ends and being tired?
It doesn't. It's exactly the same. And the point here is the principles that apply to the treatment of fatigue apply to those who are pathologically fatigued, those who have normal levels of energy who would like maybe more energy, and to improve the performance of top athletes. So it applies across the board. Now, what I call pathological fatigue is when you pay for it the next day. And guess what? If athletes push themselves to their limit, they will pay for it the next day, i.e. they won't be able to repeat that performance the next day because they've literally, burnt themselves out. So obviously, life is a balancing act. And yes, it would be lovely to have limitless energy that we could, spend and do all the things we enjoy. But we've got to earn that energy. And I always think energy is like money. It's jolly hard work earning it, but it's great fun spending it. And the other really important thing about fatigue, and the shameful thing is, I don't think that many doctors get this, is that energy delivery mechanisms are at the root of all pathological conditions, almost without exception. They are vital in preventing and reversing dementia, preventing and treating cancer, preventing and treating heart disease as well. So it's such an important topic. And if somebody comes to me and I'm not quite sure what's going on, or it's a muddy clinical picture, I always start with energy delivery mechanisms. And equally, if I have a therapist and I do training weekends, I say we always start with energy delivery mechanisms. And for you to be good at teaching your patients, you've got to do it yourself. You've got to walk the walk. 'Cause if you can't walk the walk, you'd be quite sure your patients can't walk the walk. So energy is everything. Energy is the difference between life and death. It is vital.
All right, well, let's get into these mechanisms and talk about what they are and how they go awry.
Well, the analogy I like to use is the car analogy. And for your car to go, you've got to have the right fuel in the tank, and that's all about diet and gut function. You've got to have some oxygen there, and that's all about breathing techniques. Then you need my favourite subject, mitochondrial engine. And pretty much every single living cell in the whole of the natural world, bar a few primitive yeast and bacteria, are powered by mitochondria. It's a common engine that powers all life. And then we need, for mammals anyway, well, for living animals, you need the thyroid accelerator pedal, and that controls how fast your mitochondria go. And you need the adrenal gearbox, and that's what allows us to gear up in response to a demand. So, if a saber-toothed tiger leaps out at me, I've got to run the fastest 100 meters I've ever done and get up that tree, otherwise I become breakfast. And to be able to do that, you need a massive output of energy to achieve. So that's the analogy that I like to use. But we always start off with the fuel in the tank. And for many people, that's all they have to do. If they get their diet right and their gut function right, everything else falls into place. And it's the thing they have to do first. And it's also the most difficult thing they have to do, because it means changing the habits of a lifetime. And my view is that the big thing that gets in the way is addiction. And it's addiction to sugars and carbohydrates that is the single greatest hurdle. And if you can get off sugar and carb addiction, and guess what? 99.9% of us Westerners are sugar and carbohydrate addictions. In the short term, it gives you a little hit of energy, but it makes things much worse, in the longer term. So, and that is an important thing. So I talk about a paleo-ketogenic diet, but that comes in many forms. The sickest patients I have, the ones who are worst off, I often start them on a carnivore diet. And a carnivore diet is, it's very simple to prepare. There's no question about the rules. If it comes from an animal, if it's meat, fish, eggs, or butter, butter is a great carnivore food, then, those are the rules. They're very simple rules. It's very satisfying, but it's also very low toxic diet. People forget, if you look at life from the point of view of a plant, it doesn't want to be eaten. Now, you and I don't want to be eaten either, but we can run away. Plants can't do that. So to make themselves protect themselves from being eaten, they have to make themselves as poisonous and as toxic as they possibly can. And that also, they have to be poisonous and toxic against bacteria and yeast and viruses as well. So all plant material is intrinsically toxic. Now, thankfully, we have a great liver system, a detox system that can cope with many of those toxins. But for many people, and we're all poisoned, that could be a subject we could talk all day about poisoning others. For people who are poisoned, that is just another load on the liver. And for the liver to be able to detoxify, guess what? It needs lots of energy. It needs lots of raw materials, and these people are often deficient. So the carnivore diet is often the most frictionless, quickest way to get started. Some people can't face that prospect early on, but I often find that the prospect of doing it is actually much worse than the actuality. As I say to all my patients, just do it. But the key point of the diet is low carbohydrate, high in fat. We should be fueling our body with fat for energy. And the reason for that is the preferred fuel of mitochondria. Now, as I say, mitochondria are the engines of our car. So, I've got the old truck out there that runs on diesel. She will go on petrol, a bit, but she doesn't like it. She goes much better on diesel. And it's exactly the same with us humans. We can go on sugars and carbs. We can get a lot done on that, but it's very damaging to the engine. Because when you burn sugars and carbs in mitochondria, you produce a lot of free radicals. You produce a lot of exhaust fumes. And those exhaust fumes are very damaging. Whereas if we run on fat and ketones are the most desirable fuel. They can pass through mitochondria in a very frictionless way. They produce minimal free radicals. They are minimal damage to mitochondria, to the engines of our body, and therefore they are the desirable fuel. In fact, I'll tell you a story.
Please.
This pertains to the Gulf War in 1991. Now, what's so interesting about that is that the frontline troops were told, don't expect to be refueled, to be recharged, to be resupplied in the first 5 days. You've got to carry everything you need for 5 days. And of course, if you are a soldier, fighting in the middle of the desert, the last thing you want to run out of is ammunition. So these guys stocked up with lots of ammunition at the expense of food. And that meant that by day 3, 4, and 5, they weren't well fed, they were hypoglycemic, they made bad decisions, and that's when all the deaths from friendly fire occurred. Because as I understand it, more people are killed in the Gulf from friendly fire than from enemy fire. So the United States Army commissioned Dr. Kieran Clark, researcher at Oxford University, Australian, to find out what was the most efficient fuels for those frontline soldiers to carry. Lightest, the best, most bang for your buck, as it were, the lightest fuel with the most power. And she came up with beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Now, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, nasty name, but essentially it's what fat is converted into so that it can power mitochondria. And she made it synthetically in the lab. She then fed it to world-class athletes, top rowers, top runners, top tetrathletes and cyclists. And what she found is that nearly all of them improved their personal best because they had the perfect fuel for their mitochondria, and they could run and they could perform for longer and at a higher level. Typically marathon runners who, if they're running on sugars and carbohydrates, if they don't have something to eat, they hit a wall at 17 miles. We call it hitting a wall. In this country, I think the Americans call it bonking. But they hit that wall if they don't have something to eat. Not so the keto athletes. Those keto-adapted athletes, either they were keto-adapted because they've been doing it for some time, or they'd been fueled up by Dr. Kieran Clark's beta-hydroxybutyric acid. They don't hit a wall. They can run and run and run. In fact, the world record for the longest distance run in 24 hours is held by a keto-adapted athlete called Mike Morton, and in 24 hours he ran 172 miles. Yes, he needed water. He probably needed electrolytes, but he didn't have to eat. He was running on fat. Fat is the perfect fuel for our mitochondria. So for many people, that is the single most important thing they have to do. And this is well backed up by science. Obviously, the science we've just talked about. There's a wonderful YouTube video I do recommend you look at by Dr. Kieran Clark. But we know dementia, for example. Dementia can be reversed with a ketogenic diet. Why? Because it's the perfect fuel for the brain. I mean, if you take a bit of brain and you cut into it, it doesn't bleed. It's just white, isn't it? Anybody who's watched Silence of the Lambs remembers that final scene of Hannibal Lecter slicing off some brain, and it's white. It's not full of blood. Whereas if you cut into my muscle, if you cut into a steak, it oozes blood. So that begs the question, how does the brain get fuel to it? And the answer is the brain is largely comprised of fat. Ketones are incredibly fat soluble, and they can very easily get from the bloodstream into the brain without, a massive blood supply. So the brain loves ketones as a fuel. And, many religious leaders know this. The samurai warriors knew this. Before any altercation, before any battle, the samurai warriors would fast for 24 hours. Why? They'd be in ketosis. And in ketosis, their brains would work better, so their reflexes were better, and their muscles were stronger. And guess what? You need both of those things to come out alive at the end of a battle. So ketones is the desirable fuel. And, you don't have to do a carnivore diet to get into ketosis. Just cutting out the carbs is a great start. So people always ask me, what do you eat? So a typical day, breakfast will be bacon and eggs. Just bacon and eggs, no bread with it, no fried bread, no potato or anything like that, just bacon and eggs, absolutely delicious. Lunch is usually leftovers from last night. And what I have for supper, well, the starter would be maybe a tin of prawns or smoked fish, or I've got some very nice olive patty at the moment, or I made some cod's roe patty, really easy to make, just eat off a spoon. And then main course would be a piece of meat, fish, more eggs maybe, I love eggs, and then green vegetables from the garden. And the pudding would be coconut cream, which is just 2% carbohydrate, and maybe some fruit from the deep freeze. I'm very lucky, I'm a gardener, so I've got a deep freeze full of berries. And berries are fairly low in sugars, so and that doesn't knock me out of ketosis. And then don't snack. And guess what? You don't need to snack. One of the joys of this diet is you don't get hungry. And you don't run out of fuel. I might feel a bit peckish, and guess what? I'm greedy. I love my food. But if I think to myself, is the brain working okay? Guess what? Yes, it is. Is the body functioning well? Guess what? Yes, it is. I don't need it. That is greed, not need. And the less the sugar and the carbohydrates you have, the less you crave for them. And we know that's true of all addiction, isn't it? If I had somebody who wanted to give up smoking, and I said to them, it's okay to have 1 or 2 a day, we all know that's bad advice. That just switches on to the craving, and they want more, and they want more, and they want more. Guess what the alcoholics celebrate when they do Alcoholics Anonymous? They celebrate complete abstinence. They know if they have one drink, they want another and another and another, and they're back on, and they've fallen off the wagon again. So sugars and carbohydrates are in the same category of addiction as alcohol, smoking, nicotine, caffeine, and all that. And, I know I'm an addict. Both my parents died from addiction. We can all see it in ourselves very easily if we're honest. And I find to give up addiction, I have to give up them all, because one addiction tends to switch on another. Have a bit of chocolate, have a bit of coffee, and I want to drink, and on it goes. So if I give up it all, now I'm no paragon of virtue. Here we are. It's in the autumn at the moment. We've had a fantastic summer, and I've had a plum tree fruit like it's never fruited before. And guess what? I can't resist those plums, so I do tuck into a bowl of plums for pudding. And okay, maybe it knocks me out of ketosis for a while, but that doesn't matter. The plum tree is going to stop producing plums next week. There won't be any more. I'd have had my fill, and I shall be back on the wagon again. And that's how it was for primitive man. You see, when people ask me, what should I be eating? Should I be doing the GAPS diet or the FODMAP diet or the what diet, whatever? Always, whenever you get a difficult question like that, always go back to evolutionary biology. What did we evolve over gazillions of years consuming? And the answer is a paleo-ketogenic diet. And yes, there were sugars and carbohydrates there for a short time in the autumn. And in fact, I think this is where carbohydrate addiction evolved. Because if again, look at life from the evolutionary point of view, what constrained our population was food supply. If there's plenty of food, we flourished. If we're in short supply, we starved. So we had to evolve techniques that conserved that food supply and consolidate as best as possible. So when carbohydrates are in abundance, when there's a free fall there's a windfall of fruits, of nuts, of seeds, of grains in the autumn, then we need to eat them and eat them and eat them so we get fat. And in eating and eating and eating them and getting fat, that's survival value for the winter. But it's more interesting than that. The last thing we want to do is go rushing around playing rugby and football and ice hockey and burning off all that precious food. Eating those foods makes us fatigued. It's an evolutionary survival policy. So when sugars and carbohydrates are in abundance, we switch on the carbohydrate gene, we eat and eat and eat, we get fat, we get fatigued, we don't spend that energy, and that's all in the pantry, that's survival value for the winter. But by contrast, when the winter comes along, there are no sugars and carbohydrates. We start to burn those fats to get into ketosis. And when you are in ketosis, you get clever and you have more energy. And that's what you need to be able to hunt. And, primitive man was a hunter. He hunted those big herbivores, the bison and the elephant and the mammoth. And if he and his tribe, or she and her tribe, could make one kill, a big herbivore like that would feed a tribe for a month. It's a massive game. So the cleverer you are, and the more physically able and active, and the more stamina you have, the more likely you are to succeed. And of course, the carbohydrate addiction gene is switched off because there are no carbohydrates. But of course, the problem now with modern food supply is we can eat those carbohydrates every day of the week if we want to, because we can. They're there, they're in supply. The carbohydrate addiction gene never gets switched off. So that's the problem with modern life. And once people get that idea, because giving up carbohydrates is difficult, so they have to really establish that intellectually in their mind that, that's the reason why we do this. And then appreciating all the diseases that sugars and carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods are associated with, and guess what, we don't want to die of those. Then they have the intellectual power to say, right, I'm going to do this wretched diet, whatever it takes, and I'm going to stick with it for life. Because that's what you should all be doing. Paleo-ketogenic diet, or a carnivore diet, or a carnivore intense diet, which I'm not completely carnivore, I have to confess. Especially at this time of year, I'm a keen gardener, so I do have green vegetables, but I'm in ketosis and I feel well. So I think that's good enough for me. So that's the first thing to say, to get the diet established. And to say, for many people, that's all they have to do. There's another aspect of diet which is really, really so important. And that pertains to what happens in the gut when we have too many sugars and too many carbohydrates. Because we overwhelm the ability of our upper gut to remain sterile. Now, of course, I've jumped ahead of myself. I'm very good at doing this, or rather very bad at doing that. But basically, the gut is a tube. It starts in the mouth, it finishes at the anus, and it's about 30 foot long. Now, the top 25 foot of gut should be near sterile. It should be near sterile for the business of digesting proteins, breaking down fats and absorbing them, mopping up some of the starches that are naturally present even in meats and vegetables. And as I say, it should be near sterile. Now, if we eat a lot of sugar and carbohydrates, and we're snacking all the time, breakfast, snack mid-morning, lunch, snack mid-afternoon, supper, late night munches, then you overwhelm the ability of the upper gut to remain sterile. Because when we eat food, there are inevitably bacteria and yeast in food. You can't, that's unavoidable. Okay, cooking it will reduce that to a certain extent, but all food will contain bacteria and yeast. If you eat a plum, like I did for lunchtime, it's a bag of sugar with yeast on the outside. So I've got good stomach acid, and I know that will be sterilised, and I don't have an upper fermenting gut. But if you say you've overwhelmed that ability, then those foods will start to ferment. And when those foods start to ferment in your gut, that is a disaster. It's a disaster for lots of reasons. The first thing is you ferment those foods into toxins that have to be dealt with by the liver. This condition is also called the auto-brewery syndrome. In fact, it was first described in the Journal of Nutritional Medicine about 96 by Stephen Davis and John McLaren Howard. And they took people who had enough fermenting gut. They measured the levels of sugar and alcohol in the bloodstream. They gave them a 50-gram load of sugar, which is standard for a diabetic test, for example. And then they repeated the sugar and alcohol levels half an hour later. The highest result they got was an alcohol level of 19 milligrams per deciliter, which is not far off a drunk driving ticket in this country. So you can produce significant amounts of alcohol, not just ethyl alcohol, but butyl alcohol, propyl alcohol, D-lactate, amino compounds, hydrogen sulfide, i.e. lots of nasty toxins. So that's one reason why the upper fermenting gut is real bad news. The second problem is that if you start to take some vitamins and minerals, and of course there are lots of essential nutrients in food, if you've got an upper fermenting gut, then you just feed those bacteria and yeast because they're in the front line. Oh, yum, yum, they say, I need some B3, I need some CoQ10, I need some of this, that and the other, because their metabolism is not that different from ours. So our body then becomes deficient in those micronutrients. And then the microbes themselves, again, just like plants, if you look at life from the point of view of bacteria or a yeast, having made itself comfortable on the line of your gut, it doesn't want anybody else moving in. And so those bacteria and those yeast, they produce nasty toxins to keep other bacteria and yeast at bay. And those bacterial things we call bacterial endotoxin. It's very nasty stuff. Fungi produce fungal mycotoxins. In fact, many of our antibiotics are mycotoxins, and they've got fungal names like penicillin, streptomycin, cephalosporin, gentamicin. These are all fungal products. So the microbes themselves produce toxins, which have to be dealt with by the liver, and that consumes a lot of energy. But these microbes actually live on the lining of the gut. And where they are living, there's low-grade inflammation. And low-grade inflammation makes for a leaky gut. And so there is potential for the microbes themselves to get from the lining of the gut into the bloodstream. Now, these are not evolutionarily correct microbes. These are not microbes that the immune system is familiar with. And wherever they get, they'll get into the bloodstream and circulate. And wherever they get stuck or lodged, the immune system says, oh, we've got an infection here, we've got an invasion, we better attack it. It drives inflammation. And I think many, many conditions like fibromyalgia is allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut in the muscles. Arthritis. All arthritis is allergy, and much of it is driven by allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut. They get stuck in the brain. And in the brain, and this is work done by a Japanese researcher, they have the potential to ferment out neurotransmitters in the brain into LSD and amphetamine-like substances. And that could be the basis of psychosis. They get stuck in the skin and drive urticaria. They get stuck in the lungs and drive intrinsic asthma. They get stuck in the gut and drive inflammatory bowel disease. So there is so much pathology that's driven by these little wretches that this is such an important reason why, we should sort out the upper fermenting gut.
Just to be clear here, this is like SIBO, but it's SIBO 2.0. So it encompasses what SIBO is, but it goes beyond. So Avi, explain that.
Correct. SIBO is just upper fermenting gut by bacteria, but Candida is upper fermenting gut by yeast. But maybe parasites could be involved, maybe yeast involved. We don't know because there's just not enough work done on this. But the bottom line is the treatment of SIBO, upper fermenting gut, is exactly the same. First of all, stop feeding them, carnivore diet or very, very low ketogenic diet. And secondly, kill them. And the two of my favourite tools that I use to kill that are vitamin C and iodine. Now, we are all deficient in vitamin C without exception. Not my words, but the words of Linus Pauling, jolly clever man, won two Nobel Prizes, on his own, and was only beaten to a third by Watson and Crick. But he devoted the last third of his life to the study of vitamin C. Now, what he points out is that it's humans, fruit bats, and guinea pigs that can't make their own vitamin C. So the reason my best friend, my little dog Nancy, doesn't get scurvy eating a meat diet is because she can make her own vitamin C. We can get some from meat, interestingly, but we can use vitamins in different ways. We can use vitamin C in tiny doses to stop us getting scurvy. We can use vitamin C in higher doses for optimal biochemical function. And then we can use vitamin C in super high doses, basically as an antimicrobial, as an antibiotic and anti-fungal agent. I recommend we all take 5 grams of vitamin C a day. That's about a rounded teaspoon. And a glass of water, first thing in the morning, dissolves much better in warm water, down the hatch. And vitamin C contact kills all microbes. First thing in the morning, the gut is empty, or the upper gut is empty, so you get a good concentration of vitamin C immediately hitting the stomach. And of course, the stomach is a very acid place. That's Nancy, is a very acid place. And acid kills all microbes. And so you start off the day with a nice, sterile upper gut. And then last thing at night, maybe 2 or 3 hours after you've had your evening meal, before going to bed, 3 drops of Lugol's iodine, 15% in a glass of water, down the hatch. And again, iodine contact kills all microbes. It's the best antiseptic in the world. This is why any patient having surgery will wake up, or should wake up, with the yellow all over there, over there where they've been stitched up, because iodine penetrates the skin and contact kills all microbes at 10 parts per million. It's an incredibly powerful antimicrobial. And the interesting thing about iodine is it's completely, almost entirely, it's completely harmless to humans. It doesn't interfere with the immune system's ability to heal and repair. And we're all deficient in iodine, pretty much without exception. We just don't get enough of it in our diet. So it's, there, as and both iodine and vitamin C are incredibly cheap.
Okay, coming back to vitamin C before we move forward.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that us and a couple other animals are the only ones that aren't producing it naturally in the body. How do you look at that from an evolutionary perspective? Since we did lose that, that would lead us to believe that that's a good thing if evolution had that leave our genetics. So talk about how you think about that.
That's a fabulous question. And it's a question, something I've given a lot of thought to. And I think the important thing is we evolved primarily as carnivores. We didn't evolve to eat meat. We evolved because we ate meat. So I'm a great fan of Elaine Morgan's theory that humans spent some time in evolving from water. So the story is that we started off as chimpanzees, which are our nearest relatives in Central Africa, and then there was a window of time of global warming. So the animals are forced out to the coast. And some of the chimpanzees realised that they could evade their predators by moving into the water. And moving into those shallow, warm seas, first of all, the seas were buoyant, so they could stand up on their back legs. Secondly, we lost our fur, lost our hair, we became hairy, and we evolved subcutaneous fat instead to keep warm. Our noses turned down, so that we could duck underwater without drowning. If you put a chimpanzee in water, because their nostrils turn up, the water pours into the lungs and they drown very quickly. But because our noses turn down, we can survive dipping our head underwater. And we fed on seafood and shellfish. And seafood and shellfish are extremely rich in the 2 vital fats for our brains, arachidonic acid and DHA. And that allowed our brains, and of course it's rich in iodine. Without iodine, the brains can't grow. And that allows our brains to get much larger. So a chimpanzee's brain size was about 350 mil and is still about 350 mil. At one stage, our brains were as large as 1,700 mils, hugely, 5 times larger than a chimpanzee's brain. So becoming intelligent like that made us very effective hunters. And as I say, the big prey the large herbivores were our prey, which are also rich in arachidonic acid and DHA. And eating a carnivore diet, if you eat the offal, especially the liver and the kidneys, that is rich in vitamin C. And the second thing is, if you're eating a carnivore diet, you do not have an upper fermenting gut. And my guess is an awful lot of vitamin C was used up in the business of controlling that upper fermenting gut. We're relatively protected from infection. Why? Because we're eating carnivore. As I say, it's the sugars and the carbohydrates that feed infection. I'll just tell you a story about that. And this is a story that happened to a patient of mine. She came to see me in the August, only a young lass, 23, and she had severe abscesses in her arm, a number of them. We call them a carbuncle. And she'd had these for about 2 years. She'd had every antibiotic under the sun. She'd had surgery. She'd had drains in there. The surgeons didn't dare do any more surgery because it was invading her brachial plexus, and she risked, losing the nerve supply to the arm and indeed the arm itself. But nobody had taken a dietary history. She thought it was healthy to have lots of fruit. And so she was having, pints of orange juice, pineapple juice, fruit, oranges, mangoes, whatever, grapes, and running a high blood sugar. And that was feeding that infection. And all we did, I said, right, you've got to do a ketogenic diet. So she cut out all that fruit, cut out all the sugar and the carbs, low carb diet. And then she just painted it with iodine daily. That was in the August, when the surgeons had given up with her, and without any further antibiotics, without no further surgery, by Christmas it had healed up completely. Now, that illustrates the point that sugar and carbohydrates feed infection. If you're doing a carnivore diet, it's intrinsically ketogenic, and just being ketogenic is highly protective against infection. So I think that the requirement for vitamin C was less, but of course you can get vitamin C by eating meat, especially offal. People think a carnivore diet is just loads of steak. Yes, but it's also liver, kidney, if you can get it, bone marrow, if you can eat it, brains. It's also all the other cuts of meat that are so important. So the point is that they survived. And the other key factor here is evolution is only interested in us getting to child rearing age. You see, I'm on the evolutionary scrap heap. No more babies from me, I'm afraid. All the eggs have gone, and my daughters are launched. It doesn't matter if I die. It doesn't matter if I don't live to a great age, because, as I say, I've passed on my genes, and that's that. And that's where the real problems of vitamin C deficiency really cut in old age, because we know the vitamin C deficiency is again associated with cancer, majorly heart disease and dementia. So it's a combination of those things which allowed us to get away with the fact that we can't make our own vitamin C. Now, my guess is there are probably other facets to that story which I will discover in the future, but I'm happy with those explanations for the time being.
Coming back to your diet, you gave us an idea coming into fall what you're eating. How will that change in the winter? Because you're not going to have access to your plums.
Correct.
You won't have access to berries. Does that mean you go carnivore at that time?
Very much, yeah. Carnivore and green vegetables, Now, I do have a deep freeze, so I do have berries in the deep freeze, so I do cheat a little bit. But the thing is you see, one doesn't have to be a paragon of virtue 24/7. I know I can get away with some berries. I enjoy them. I love them. It's my great treat in the evening, especially with a big dollop of coconut cream, which is, as I say, is pretty much pure saturated fat and only 2% carb. So I'm a bit better off than primitive man. But yes, I say in the winter I'll have sprouts. I've got brassicas in the gardens. I've got some pulses in the deep freeze, some broad beans, and yes, I do have a few potatoes. But the way I love potatoes, but the way I cook them is I boil them up in the morning and let them cool down. And that converts some of the starch into resistant starch. And I slice it very thinly and fry them in pig fat or beef fat or coconut oil, and I only need 2 or 3, and I'm very satisfied. It fills me up. I don't have to have a lot of them. In fact, that's the basis of my addiction test, because I know I'm an addict. And my addiction test is if I can have a couple of, and I don't want any more, that's fine. So if you gave me a bar of 100% chocolate, I'd have a couple of squares and I wouldn't want any more. But if you gave me a bar of 60% chocolate, I wouldn't be happy until the whole bar had gone. So say that's my personal addiction test. And if I can have a couple of chips of potato and I don't want any more, that's okay. But if I have one of, if somebody offered me a biscuit, for example, and I ate it, the whole packet would go. If somebody offered me a crisp and I ate it, the whole packet would go. I'm that much of an addict. So I do have the self-control to say no to the first crisp or the first, biscuit, but not the third or the fourth or the fifth. It's the same in nuts. I love nuts, but cashew nuts, I adore them. If I have one cashew nut, the whole packet goes. So I know I can't have cashew nuts, but offer me a Brazil nut and I'll have one and I don't want any more. So that's a useful, well, it works for me, and I find many people find that a useful guide.
What about your PK bread? Is that still a staple?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's very easy to make. These days, I tend to make it. I used to make a loaf, and then I made rolls, and then I made flatbreads. These days, I roll it out really thin to make crisp bread, and that keeps much better. And yes, that's delicious. A big slab of butter on it, and then the pate or the fish or the cod's-roe pate or whatever it is that I've got, liver pate, is a great starter for an evening meal.
All right, so point blank, you're having an animal-based diet, at times carnivore-ish. Do you think you'd be better off taking plants out completely? Are they just in there for fun? I just want to make sure we're clear on this.
That's a very, very good question. The fact of the matter is we do have a great liver that is very good at detoxing, so we can get away with stuff. And I suppose the answer is the sicker you are and the older you get, the more you have to toughen up with the diet. Because I'm a keen gardener and I've got lots of stuff in the garden, I hate not consuming that. So, but I'm in the throes of turning my garden into a more carnivore garden. So that I've got chickens, for example, so I'm going to protect all the areas that I'm growing and let the chickens free range through the rest of it. So I can get more eggs and more chicken out of that. But now at the moment, I know I'm not perfect carnivore, but I should think 80% of my calories, 90% of my calories come from carnivore. And so at the moment, there's plums in the garden, which are a bit of a temptation, and Brussels sprouts and cabbage, but they're all fairly low GI. But the bottom line is, it doesn't knock me out of ketosis. I'm always in ketosis, and that is the key. You see, sugar is an essential for the body. We cannot live with zero sugar. And of course, the body can get round that with a carnivore diet because we can convert protein into sugar if necessary. But sugar is an essential raw material to make DNA, to make RNA, to make the energy molecule ATP. We also use sugar for detoxification in the liver. So it is an important molecule, but it's also a very dangerous molecule. Just like petrol in your car, it's essential to make the car go. But, you can make Molotov cocktails and bombs, can't you, out of petrol? It's very inflammable, dangerous stuff. And sugar is the same. So the body has mechanisms for keeping sugar under very tight control. We should keep the blood sugar between 4 and 6.5 it would be perfect. In fact, some people find that continuous glucose monitoring is very helpful. And, on Amazon, in this country, for about 60 quid, you can get a monitor, you can stick it on the back of your arm, you can read it on your smartphone, and you can see exactly what is happening, when you consume different foods. Because different people do respond to eating sugars and carbs differently. We're all unique in our own way. So let's just talk briefly about how we control blood sugar, because that's very important.
Sounds good. Actually, first though, let me ask you one more follow-up there. The one argument you'd get from somebody having an animal-based diet with low-carb vegetables would be the fiber for the microbiome. And then producing short-chain fatty acids. So I want your thoughts on that.
That is a brilliant question, and it's one I have agonized over, I can assure you. And talking and listening, watching podcasts and listening to people who are doing carnivore diets, what's so interesting is that the quality of the microbiome improves. Now, it improves in terms of numbers and diversity, as I understand things. Again, the key thing about the microbiome is we don't know anything about it. We know very little about it. There are hundreds of papers that have been produced that says, well, this is associated with that and this is associated with the other. But we still don't really know how to improve the microbiome. Now, my personal view is that the single most important thing you can do is to eat organic food. Now, you may be aware of Stephanie Senath's book, A Toxic Legacy, where she's talking about glyphosate. Glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world, but it's extremely toxic stuff. It's a known carcinogen, it's a known mutagen. In her book, Senath calculates that in America, glyphosate is used at such a rate that is equivalent to about every American consuming about a pound of glyphosate a year. Call that 450 grams, 365 days a year. On average, the average American is consuming 1 gram of glyphosate a day. Now, 1 gram of glyphosate is not a trace amount. That is a therapeutic dose. Most drugs come in milligram amounts. So we're consuming this pesticide at 100 or 1,000 times the level of a prescription drug, prescription drug for blood pressure, for example. Senath points out that 54% of the microbiome is sensitive to glyphosate, is killed by glyphosate. And my guess is that many of the tests we're doing and the research we're doing is not factoring that into the equation. So, the first important thing we know is that a carnivore diet is not at all damaging for the microbiome. In fact, it's probably very good for the microbiome. And I can show you case histories of where some of the best results have come from people doing a carnivore diet. And the second thing is eat as organic as you possibly can. Now, if you'd asked me that question 3 months ago, you'd have got a different answer. If you'd asked me that question 3 months ago, I'd said, oh, yes, a diverse gut microbiome is very important. And we probably achieve that by consuming a diverse diet. And there's some logic to that. I can see how that, different fibers would, different microbes would predicate on different foods, for example. But I don't know if you're familiar with a wonderful author called Professor Nick Lane, who writes extensively on mitochondria, evolutionary biology. And I was rereading his mitochondria book the other day. And he made the point about the microbiome and carnivore diets, which I thought was fascinating, is that bacteria live on the waste products of other bacteria. It's like little fleas have big fleas on their backs to bite them. Little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. So one bacteria will produce lactase as a waste product, and that will be gobbled up by another bacteria, which will produce something else a waste product, and so it will go on. So you might get chains of bacteria and viruses and yeast all, consuming each other's waste products. And that may be part of the explanation why, a carnivore diet might not be diverse in terms of the different fibers that are there, but actually is a very rich diet. Very often my carnivore patients say that, when they're eating a lot of fat, they get fat coming through in the stool. And you can imagine protein coming through in the stool as well. And bacteria loving that. It's a free food, it's a free lunch for them, isn't it? So I hear what you're saying, but I don't, I think that, and again, we evolved eating a carnivore diet. So that must be right for our microbiome. We've got hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to back that up. And people eating sugar, carbohydrate, highly processed foods usually have a narrow microbiome with small numbers, but which can't be good.
You talked about the importance there of going organic, reducing the glyphosate. When it comes to animal foods, how do you look at quality there?
if you look at the actual amount of a toxic chemical, per kilogram, it's much, much lower in meats and carnivore foods than it is in vegetables. And that's because the animals themselves have a chance to process those toxins out. And again, one of the big problems with glyphosate is it's often applied pre-harvesting. You see, if you're a farmer and you've got a field of wheat or corn or barley or whatever, what you want to do is you want to harvest it bone dry. If it's harvested wet, then it costs a fortune in the silos, the grain silos, because you have to dry it out. You spend a lot of money, blasting hot air through to dry it out. So you want to harvest dry, and the way they do that is just before the harvest is ready to come, the whole thing is sprayed with glyphosate and it's killed. And if it's killed, the water just disappears out of it. And so you can harvest it bone dry. But what that means is that all that glyphosate that you're spraying on goes straight into the grain silos. It goes straight into the food chain. So we're getting very high levels in our grains and anything else that might be sprayed pre-harvest. My guess is the grains, it's the soya, which are the most intensively polluted. Foods like avocado and coconuts, which are high in fat, they're not sprayed at all or barely at all. They're the most organic we can consume. Many fruits are sprayed. The worst sprayed of all in this country are strawberries. Of course, because you see, the fruit producers themselves know that we're sugar addicts. And so and of course you want to sell something, you produce something addictive, don't you? Whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or sugar or whatever. So the fruit producers are breeding lines of fruit that are sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And of course that makes them even more attractive to the bacteria and the yeast because they love sugar too. So many fruits, especially the sweet ones, are extensively sprayed throughout their growing and their harvesting. So these foods are going to have much higher levels of chemicals than carnivore foods. So I'm very privileged. I've got a small holding here. So I have my own pigs and chickens. And in this country, it's the pigs and chickens that are intensively reared, and they're the ones that receive a lot of poor quality grains and poor quality foods. I don't have sheep and cows because I live in Wales, and everything out here is grass-fed. So I'm just looking at the field in front. I've got a field of cows and sheep, and guess what? They're all eating grass. So and that grass is never sprayed. So my rules are: I've got my own. If you're going to buy organic pork and organic chicken, but grass-fed, free range. Lamb from New Zealand, cow from Argentina, for example, in this country, from Wales or from England, would be pretty good stuff.
Do we have any idea of things like glyphosate going on the grains being fed to conventional animals? How much of that will end up in the food we eat?
It's a very good question. And the shameful thing is, nobody's done that study. I mean, a very dear friend of mine, Mark Purdy, was interested in organophosphates. And of course, glyphosates are also chemically organophosphates. And organophosphates used to be used regularly in this country for the treatment of warble fly. And you pour it down the back of the animal and it goes straight in. And of course, it comes straight out in the milk. And the one that was being used particularly in dairy products was one called fenthion. So he got in touch with the ministry here and said, how much fenthion is coming through into the milk of a cow that's, just been treated with organophosphate? Oh, they said, we don't know. We've never done that study, but it'll get mixed in with all the other cows, and therefore it'll be diluted, and therefore it won't be a problem. But they've never measured it. I mean, the shameful thing is that governments don't do research that might result in an unacceptable conclusion. They don't do what I call blue sky research. They only do research when they're pretty sure of the answer. So they don't want to know the answer to those sort of questions. And so that research isn't done. The answer is we don't know.
We have the toxicity aspect like we just talked about. And then we have the nutritional potential there when it comes to chickens and pigs like yours, or grass-fed, grass-finished cows. How do you look at the importance of that from a nutrition perspective?
if you're eating grass-fed meat and organic, you're winning on both sides of the equation, aren't you? Because the toxic load is less and the nutritional quality is much higher. And there's a balancing act between these two things, because with really excellent nutrition is protective against toxic stress. So this is where a good carnivore diet is going to protect against the toxic stress of having some vegetables, and nuts and seeds or whatever in your diet. As we mentioned before, food is intrinsically toxic, not just because it's been fermented, but because foods themselves have toxins like oxalates and phytates and tannins and phytoestrogens in which are toxic. But as I say, our liver can cope with them. But if you've got really good nutrition, good grass-fed meat, good organic food, it's not going to be a problem. That's how we've been eating for the past hundreds of thousands of years. But now we're all poisoned. We are all overloaded, not just with plant toxins and products of the upper fermenting gut, but with chemicals, with pesticides, with volatile organic compounds, with heavy metals, with goodness knows what metals they're using for cloud seeding, dental amalgam fillings, aluminium in vaccines. We're all poisoned with these heavy metals. In fact, I must have done, well, certainly hundreds of toxicity tests, either fat biopsies looking for pesticide levels or volatile organic compounds, or urine tests with a chelating agent looking at heavy metals. I've never seen a normal result. We all, without exception, carry a toxic load. Now, I say, thankfully, the liver is very good at dealing with that, but we're getting overwhelmed. And there's no question that heavy metals are carcinogenic, mutagenic. So are many pesticides and volatile organic compounds. So we have to do everything within our power to keep that toxic load down. And the sickest patients are going to be the most poisoned. And the sickest patients are those that need the least toxic diet. And that's why I often start them off on carnivore. And then in parallel with that, do detox regimes, which are very simple. We can all do them. You don't need a special expensive clinic. Do detox regimes to reduce our total toxic load. And that could be we could spend a whole podcast talking about that, Jesse.
Well, we did cover it last time. We'll get into it again towards the end here.
Perfect.
Before I jumped in with some follow-up questions there, you were going to take us in a different direction. Do you remember what that was?
Energy delivery mechanisms.
Let's go there.
Having got the fuel in the tank, we then have to think about our mitochondria. So mitochondria are the engines of our body, and it's mitochondria which take fuel from the bloodstream, hopefully in the form of ketones, but of course they can run on sugars, and they burn that in the presence of oxygen to generate energy. And that energy is generated in the form of an energy molecule, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, for mitochondria to work, first of all, they've got to have the right fuel in the tank. We've talked about that. Then they have to have certain raw materials. Now, I learned so much from Nick Lane's book, and also from Dr. Stephen Sinatra, who's a cardiologist's book, The Sinatra Solution. And there are 5 raw materials that come up time and time again as deficiency. Number 1 is magnesium. I think of magnesium as the spark plug of our engines. Now, when my old, of course, they're all compression engines now, so it's not quite the same. But the spark plug it's magnesium that is essential for enzyme systems to catalyze many of the reactions that go on in mitochondria. Secondly, we need coenzyme Q10 and niacinamide, vitamin B3. And I think of both of those as the oil of our engine. They are the most important acceptors and donators of electrons in mitochondria. It's that allows this very smooth biochemical flow that generates energy. Number 3 is acetyl-l-carnitine. And I think of acetyl-l-carnitine as the nozzle that gets fuel into your car. So carnitine is what grabs acetate groups, from the bloodstream, from the cell, flicks them into the mitochondria where they can be used as a fuel, and then goes back to grab another one. So, and of course, acetyl-l-carnitine comes from meat. Carnitine, meat. And then the 5th one is d-ribose. And ribose is the raw material from which we make ATP. It's a 5-carbon sugar. And if we really push ourselves and overdo things and develop pathological fatigue, we can run out of ATP. And d-ribose allows us to make brand new ATP very quickly. So those are the 5 supplements that I routinely recommend for anybody with a pathological fatigue. And the doses are magnesium 200 milligrams, and that needs vitamin D 10,000 IU for its absorption. Coenzyme Q10 100 milligrams, niacinamide 1500 milligrams, acetyl-l-carnitine maybe 1 gram a day, and then d-ribose maybe 10 grams a day. So those are the dosing. Then mitochondria can go slow because they're blocked by something. And again, thanks to John McLaren Howard, who's a brilliant biochemist at Acumen Laboratories, he developed tests of mitochondrial function where he could actually look and see what it was that was blocking their function, either by looking at the rate of oxidative phosphorylation or by looking at the rate by which ATP is transported out of mitochondria into the cell to do its job and then recycled back into mitochondria to be reformed. That's called translocator protein studies. And what came out top of the pops is lactic acid. So if you overdo things, if you push yourself beyond what is comfortable, then you will switch into anaerobic respiration, metabolism, which is very inefficient. That produces lactic acid and it makes mitochondria going even slower. My guess, and this is only a guess, is that lactic acid is the natural brake on mitochondria. It's what stops them spinning out of control. But it emphasizes the importance of pacing our activity. I know it sounds very boring, and when you've got lots of energy, you don't have to pace your activity. You just get on, do what you have to do. But for my pathologically fatigued, they do have to pace. So lactic acid comes out number 1. Number 2 is probably malondialdehyde, which is indicates poor antioxidant status. Well, we've covered that, haven't we? Because we were taking a big dose of vitamin C and we're taking a good package of nutritional supplements. So, we've sorted that one. And then what comes up, guess what? All the things we've talked about: pesticides, volatile organic compounds, heavy metals. Sometimes we see viral or viral protein stuck on there. But the point is, we're all poisoned and we all need to do detox regimes. In fact, one of the ones that commonly comes up there are hair dyes. The only safe hair dye is henna orange, and makes your head give you be a redhead. All other hair dyes are known carcinogens, and of course they're readily absorbed through the skin. So that's why I'm grey. Yes, I'm old, but I'm going to stay looking old. My favourite comic writer is one of them is P.G. Wodehouse. I don't know if you heard of him, but he points out that there is a cure for grey hair. As he said, it was invented by a Frenchman and it's called the guillotine. But I think I'll stick with my grey hair for the time being.
Let's come back to lactic acid before you move forward here. So it sounds like with people that are really suffering, they don't want to produce that. Talk more about specifics, what that looks like.
Okay.
And then is it ever a good thing as a hormetic stress?
Absolutely right on both points. Well, we can now get mitochondrial function tests done in Germany by Professor Birgitte Koenig. And what she points out, which I hadn't appreciated, I'm ashamed to say, is that we normally make 90% of our energy aerobically with mitochondria, and that's incredibly efficient. But we also normally make up to 10% anaerobically, producing lactic acid. So this is a very normal part of normal energy generation. Now, the problem is if your mitochondria go down, if they can't meet energy demands, and guess what happens? If you were running a marathon and you were sprinting for the line, to get that extra bit of energy, you go into lactic acid metabolism as well as mitochondrial metabolism. It gives you that little extra bit of energy, say, to sprint for the line, which might make the difference between a gold medal and an also ran, but it's not sustainable. And that's why the athletes collapse on the line, because they've got so much lactic acid in their body, their muscles cannot work anymore. Now, if you've got good mitochondrial function, you can reverse that situation very quickly. I don't know if you're aware of something called the Cori cycle. It's a nasty bit of biochemistry. But essentially, if you produce too much lactic acid, if you produce energy anaerobically, to generate lactic acid, from one molecule of acetate, you get 2 molecules of ATP. If you do it aerobically via mitochondria, from one molecule of acetate, you get 36 molecules of ATP. So it's much more efficiently burning stuff aerobically. But as I say, we do go into anaerobic metabolism. Those extra 2 molecules of ATP can make the difference, say, between a gold medal and also RAM. But lactic acid inhibits mitochondria, and eventually you crash down, you keel over. Of course, the best example of this is Philippides. He was the Greek messenger who ran from the Battle of Marathon to inform the Greek king that a great victory has been achieved. He pushed himself to such an extent that he dropped dead. He gasped out his message and he dropped dead. So he would produce so much lactic acid, he'd stopped his mitochondria working completely. Probably apocryphal, but it illustrates the point. But if you generate lactic acid, say from one molecule of acetate, you can get 2 molecules of ATP. But to get that back to acetate takes 6 molecules of ATP. So going into anaerobic metabolism like that is like borrowing money from a loan shark at 300%. It's a rotten deal. Okay, it gives you a brief window of time when, you can achieve that little bit more, but then you have to pay it back. Now, if you've got good aerobic metabolism, you can pay it back, in 30 seconds, in a minute. So the athletes, collapse on the line, probably with angina, probably with every muscle in his body aching. But after a minute or two, he's recovered, he can get up and he can trot round his victory circuit. But this is where it's different with the fatigue syndrome patients. Because the patients that I see with pathological fatigue, who are bedbound, who can't move, if they go into anaerobic metabolism, and it's very difficult sometimes for them not to, and they get that extra little bit of energy, they haven't got the aerobic metabolism to get lactic acid back to acetate. And that lactic acid hangs around for an awful long time. And they get chest pain and they get muscle pain. And because it doesn't fit the bill of angina, because it doesn't go away in a couple of minutes, it takes hours and sometimes days to go away, they're told, you don't have angina, you have atypical chest pain, which is not a diagnosis at all, it's just a clinical picture. So that lactic acid burn is a very particular problem for those severely fatigued patients. For the athletes, a bit of what lactic acid does is it stimulates the production of more mitochondria. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. That takes a few days or maybe weeks. And this is why the athletes, to get fit, they don't want to be training every single day. The most efficient way to build muscle and get fitter is to push yourself to your limit on one day, whatever that limit may be. So the weightlifters will lift until the muscles, they can't put out another weight and the muscle fails. And they work around the various muscle groups in an organised way. But at the point at which the muscle fails, you've got maximum lactic acid burn, and that stimulates more mitochondria. So the difference between a little muscle and a big muscle is not the number of muscle fibers, it's the number of mitochondria supplying that muscle. And the most powerful stimulus to mitochondria is that lactic acid burn. But you need to get the lactic acid burn, get to the point where the muscle fails, and then leave it a couple of days to give the body a chance to build up those mitochondria can increase their number, and then you go for it again. And so, you can, with this high intensity interval training, as it's called, you can build muscle incredibly efficiently. And for those muscles builders, I'd say take the mitochondrial package. I'd probably add in creatine as well, because that is a proven benefit for improving mitochondrial function and therefore bigger muscles.
For somebody right now suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, what does exercise look like for them as they're working out of that?
Well, the key is the delay factor. Now, I would love to have, a fatigueometer. I could clap on somebody's chest and say, stop now. But of course, that doesn't exist. So it's very personal. And the key is you do whatever you can get away with without paying for it the next day. If you're paying for it the next day, that delayed fatigue means that you've overdone things. And as I say, for some people who are very really sick, it's very difficult not to overdo things, because anything that they try, they end up overdoing things. So it's very boring in the early stages, but I say you've got to adjust your activity so that every day is about the same and you don't get that delayed fatigue. And then as you put in place the diet, the mitochondrial package, maybe the thyroid and the adrenal stuff, which we can talk about, then you're in a position to be able to gradually increase your activity, so long as you don't pay for it the next day. So that's the general rule.
Let's come back to our upper fermenting gut. We left that story in the middle. We've talked about vitamin C in the morning, iodine at night. Last time you were on, we talked about MSM being part of that protocol. Are you still a fan of that?
Oh, hugely. Again, what I'm looking for is, you see, there aren't enough doctors like you and me to go round. There just aren't enough of us. And so what we have to do is to develop tools that everybody can use, that are not on prescription and can be easily incorporated into your everyday life. And those tools must be safe, cheap, effective, and multitask. And one of my favourite multitasking tools is MSM. Now, I learned much of this again from Stephanie Seneff, brilliant US researcher, who points out that we are all deficient in sulfur, almost without exception. And sulfur is a very, very important molecule. It's a very important molecule because it improves something called fourth phase or exclusion zone water, which we can talk about. But the thing is, we're all deficient. And without that sulfur, there are so many things that we can't do. But as far as the gut is concerned, MSM has the very attractive property of killing microbes in an aerobic environment, and the upper gut is largely aerobic. But in an anaerobic environment, i.e. where the microbiome is, it acts as a prebiotic, it feeds them, it's a fuel source for bacteria. So that makes the double whammy for the gut. And also by improving, and of course, this is why another reason why the carnivore diet is so healthy, because it's naturally rich in sulfur. Meat, is rich in sulfur. So, and this I think also explains why constipation is not a problem in people doing a carnivore diet, because again, we were taught at medical school, and I carried this myth with me for many decades before I saw the light. We taught that constipation is all about not enough fibre in the diet. But as the carnivores point out, adding more fibre to the diet is like adding more cars to a traffic jam. It's not going to get at the root cause of the problem. And my guess is that constipation is all about friction. It's the friction between the lining of the gut and the gut contents. And if you've got a frictionless, or near frictionless interface there, then the gut contents are going to slide through effortlessly, and constipation is just not going to be a problem, or not going to be an issue. Now, with the carnivore diet, you might not produce a daily turd, but when you do produce it, if it's passed effortlessly, problem solved. You're not going to get piles, you're not going to get anal fissures, you're not going to get all the problems associated with constipation. And the mechanism by which MSM improves fourth phase, and the mechanism is because MSM improves fourth phase water. We know that as a fact. Do you want me to talk briefly about fourth phase water?
Yeah, give us an overview of what that is, and then you can talk about MSM and tie that in.
Another one of my favourite subjects. Now, this is all thanks to the wonderful work of a fantastic physicist called Gerald Pollack, who was back looking at water again. Now, we know water can exist in three phases. It can exist as a solid, that's called ice, as a liquid, that's called water, and as a gas, and that's called steam. But he points out that it can also exist as a fourth phase. And that's what water molecules do against a surface. And that surface can be a fat-loving surface or a water-loving surface. Now, the chemical formula of water is H2O, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. An oxygen is comprised of 6 protons, and protons have a positive charge. Hydrogen ions only have 1 proton. And that means that the electron cloud is slightly pulled towards the oxygen atom, because the oxygen atom's got a 6 proton pull and hydrogen's only got a 1 proton pull. So what it means is every water molecule, the oxygen atom is slightly negatively charged, and the hydrogen atoms are slightly positively charged. And against the surface, they will align in a honeycomb-like structure. And a positive hydrogen to a negative oxygen, to a positive hydrogen to a negative oxygen, to a positive hydrogen, and so on. And that honeycomb structure piles up one layer on top of another in layers of very organized, structured, gel-shaped water. So just to illustrate that point, if you totted up all the molecules in your body, you and I are 99% water. 99% of the molecules in our body are water molecules. So if they were in a liquid phase, we'd just drop on the floor like a puddle, wouldn't we? But it's this structured water that gives us our form, our shape, that's the rigidity. But if you tot up all the electrons and protons in there, you find it doesn't add up. You've got too many protons. It doesn't quite fit. And so this is why this water is also called exclusion zone water. So we've got 3 names now. Exclusion zone water, because it excludes the protons. The protons get squeezed out, they get shoveled out. And what this means in practice is that every surface in our body, every cell surface, every mitochondrial surface, every red cell, every white cell, every platelet, every protein has got this jacket, this coating of structured charged water. It's all negatively charged. Now, if you've got 2 magnets, and you put them together, and they don't touch, do they? They push each other apart, and so they can move across each other effortlessly. In fact, there's a train system in Japan, in China, that's been developed that runs on this system. The rails are electromagnetically charged, so the train hovers over the surface, and it can get 400 kilometers an hour. It flies along because there's no friction there. It's the same in the body. Every surface is negatively charged, so there's no friction there. And so it should be in the lining of the gut as well. And what we know from Stephanie Steinhaus's work and Gerald Pollack's work is that having some sulfur molecules around massively increases the thickness of that EZ water. And increasing the thickness of it, you increase the charge of it. So it's even more negatively charged. And therefore things move around even more in a more frictionless way. And in the gut, this is very helpful because it means the gut contents can flow through very easily. It's essential in the bloodstream because it accounts for capillary circulation and allows blood to flow in a near frictionless way. In fact, one fascinating example of this is that if you take some poor animal, let's not think of the animal, and you stop and you anaesthetize it and you stop the heart beating, so long as you keep that animal warm, the blood will continue to circulate for several hours. And it's driven by the electrical force of exclusion zone water, which takes place in the capillaries, and the fact that blood is near frictionless when it's kept at the right temperature and is flowing. So it's all about EZ water. And I think this also has the other major use that I use for MSM is for detoxing heavy metals. Now, we know we can get rid of pesticides and volatile organic compounds by heating regimes, but you can't get heavy metals out. They don't come out in the sweat, or they don't come out, they don't mobilize from subcutaneous fat when you get hot. And the reason for that is these heavy metals actually get incorporated into body tissues. They get stuck in the heart, they get stuck in the kidneys, in the bone, in the brain. And the reason I think they get stuck there is because if we get deficient in a mineral like zinc or magnesium or selenium, and guess what? Deficiencies of those 3 minerals are very common. The body will grab something that looks similar. And if it grabs mercury or aluminium or cadmium or arsenic, which we all carry in our bodies, then they actually get incorporated in that tissue and they get stuck there. Now, what's so fascinating is I had a patient who came to see me, and again, this is another story. Lovely guy, Frank Dalton. Yes, I can use his name. He's given me permission. Who was very interested in his heavy metal loads. And he was doing tests of heavy metal poisoning every 6 months. And when we test for heavy metals, there's no point just doing urine tests because you won't see anything. You have to use a chelating agent. And there are several that can be used, but the one I like to use is DMSA. dimethylsuccinic acid, because you can take it by mouth. So this makes it, doable for my patients. And the way that it works is you wake up one morning, you take a dose of DMSA, 16 milligrams per kilogram body weight, collect the urine for the next 6 hours, and then measure the heavy metals that are there. And that gives you a pretty good idea if you're toxic. And he started doing these tests about 4 years ago now. And the first test and the second test showed that a bit spike of mercury, which often comes out, a spike of lead. And then after that, it was fairly normal. And he continued to do these for a while. I said, Frank, you don't need to go on doing these tests because it looks like we've got out all the heavy metals. No. He carried on. Now, it just so happened I started him on MSM for another reason. I think it's for his fermenting gut. And when we did the next test, a whole load of other toxic metals came out that we hadn't seen previously, like aluminium, tungsten, tin, gallium, gadolinium, bismuth, a whole load of them, which was just fascinating because, I'd never seen these come out in a heavy metal test before. So that made me start thinking, what's going on here? Now, what I'm about to say now is hypothesis, but it kind of makes sense. We know MSM or sulfur is essential for exclusion zone water. We know that any charged metal ion, whether it's aluminium or selenium or magnesium, whatever, will have a coating of exclusion zone water over it because the charges make that happen. And my view is that having that coating of EZ water is like putting clothes on a human being. So if 6 naked men walked into my office, I don't suppose that day is having that, but I might have difficulty, working out who was who. But if one was dressed up as the Pope, and one was as a policeman, and one was in a soldier's uniform, I'd know exactly who was who. I'd recognise them from their clothes. And my guess is that is the same with minerals in the body. If they have got a good coating of exclusion zone water, as magnified by sulfur, then the body can much more readily distinguish that's a friendly zinc, we want that. That's an unfriendly mercury, we can get rid of that. And of course, that is very important. But that also explains why when I do these urine tests, if I use DMSA, yes, it pulls out the heavy metals, or some of them, but it also pulls out many of the friendlies as well. It pulls out, always get high levels of copper, often get high levels of zinc, selenium, manganese, cobalt, chromium. But when I do this test with MSM, those levels are normal. So what that tells me is that the MSM is in some way allowing the body to separate the friendlies from the unfriendlies and chuck out the unfriendlies. Now, if that is the case, and as we speak, I'm organising a citizens paper. So these are some of my patients who are self-funding, who are doing this test. They have to. The deal is they have to pay for the test, but they get my interpretation for nothing. So that's my input, and then we will publish this, the multi-authorship. So every person who takes part will become an author of this paper. So it would be Myhill et al. To confirm if that observation holds true for larger numbers of people. So would be so interesting because if this is the case, then MSM, which is so cheap, you can buy 30 kilograms of, you can buy a kilogram of organic MSM for about 30 quid. And it's very inexpensive. So everybody can do this. And everybody should do this because guess what? We're all poisoned by heavy metals. And you might say, well, why are we all poisoned by heavy metals? And the answer is mining. As soon as you start to mobilise oil, gas, coal from the Earth's crust, you're going to be mobilising all these heavy metals that inevitably get into farming, that inevitably get into the food chain, that inevitably contaminate our food and our water and the atmosphere. So whether we like it or not, we're all increasingly exposed. But the joy is MSM could be a brilliant way to protect us.
Okay, so MSM can pull these heavy metals out. What comes up for me as you explain that is safely getting them out of the body once they're mobilized. Does MSM do that?
Absolutely. And I know that because we're measuring it in the urine. These tests, I'm seeing great spunks of tungsten, tin, aluminium. Now, I'm so pleased about that because aluminium is one of the most abundant metals in the Earth's crust. And we're all exposed to aluminium, whether we like it or not. Aluminium cans, aluminium foil, aluminium in vaccines, we're all exposed to aluminium. Now, the expert in this is a guy called Chris Exley. He's a professor. His nickname is Mr. Aluminium. There's nothing he doesn't know about aluminium. And he maintained that the only effective way to get aluminium out is to take silica water. Now, silica water directly displaces aluminium from its binding sites and out it comes. Yes, that's true, but silica water is very expensive. Many of my patients with fatigue syndrome, they can't work. They haven't got any money. They can't afford silica water, but they can afford MSM. That's a fraction of the price. And, I'm seeing spikes of aluminium in so many cases that, I don't know for sure that it does it, but I'm fairly confident that that will be effective.
Okay, that makes sense now that you re-explain that. You're seeing it in the urine, these different heavy metals, so we know they're coming out. Just to layer on top of that, I guess my only concern still would be, are certain ones being mobilized and then redeposited in the body?
Possibly, but the fact is, if it's coming out in the urine, that's a net loss. You do raise a very interesting point there, because I had one person get in touch with me, thankfully not one of my patients, who thought, right, I can take MSM, and started herself on big doses of, and she immediately went into atrial fibrillation. Now, there may have been other reasons. She was in her 70s, but thankfully when she stopped the MSM, she jumped back into normal rhythm. So, and even when I started on MSM, and again, always start low doses and build up slowly, I got quite a marked detox reaction. I just didn't feel right I got quite a nasty headache. I didn't feel right for a couple of weeks, and then that all tailed off. So to me, getting those sort of detox reactions, and I'm not the only person that's experienced those, is a good sign. It tells me, yes, the MSM is mobilizing the stuff, but as I say, it's coming out in the urine. There is a net loss of it overall. So what that means, and this is a general rule that applies across the board, especially to people who are very sick, is whenever you put in place a healing intervention, which might be diet, it might be supplements, it might be sorting out the upper fermenting gut, it might be detoxing. Whenever you put in place a healing intervention, expect a healing crisis. And this is a very well recognized phenomenon in homeopathy and naturopathic medicine, for example. Either because you're detoxing, because you're mobilizing, maybe because you're getting a Herxheimer reaction because you're killing off offending microbes. So the general rule is, the sicker the person is, the lower and the slower you go. And sometimes when I see very sick patients, and as I call it, the clinical waters are muddy. They've got a shopping list of symptoms. They've been sick for decades. Nobody, they're taking all these drugs. Nobody has really been able to impact. Sometimes it's impossible to say this symptom is due to that, or this picture is due to the other. You just have to put it all in place. But you have to go slowly, and you have to start low and go slow. And getting these healing crises, these detox reactions, these diet reactions, these Herxheimer reactions, as they're called, see that as a good sign. So what this means is that the road to recovery is not going to be a smooth path. It's not going to be an easy route. It's going to be a bumpy path. And, you'll get a bit better, and then you have a problem, and then you get a bit better, and then there'll be another problem as you mobilize these chemicals and move things on. And that's, for many people, that's very difficult. It's very discouraging. And this is why people have to really understand, or have a good idea or clear idea in their own mind's eye of the path that they're having to tread, and the route they're having to follow, so that when things do go wrong, they know, I know I'm doing the right thing. Intellectually, this is correct. I have to take a leap of faith and just stick with it, and then it comes right again. So as I say, it's always a bumpy ride.
All right, to recap on upper fermenting gut, we go on the PK diet, we starve these microbes. We've talked about MSM, iodine, vitamin C. Let's go over what dosage is and specifics about taking those supplements.
Okay.
And then let's end that piece. How long does all this take?
Okay. With dosages, I usually aim for vitamin C 5 grams a day. Iodine, Lugol's iodine, 15%, 3 drops last thing at night. Now, the thing is to separate vitamin C and iodine. One is a reducing agent, the other is an oxidizing agent. One's an electron donor, the other's an electron receiver. I can never remember which way around it is, but it doesn't matter. The thing to remember is don't take them at the same time. And then MSM build up to 3 teaspoons a day for a window of time of maybe 3 months, and then down to a maintenance dose of half a teaspoon a day. What we haven't talked about, of course, which is another fantastic way to clean up the upper fermenting gut, is intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating. And, of course, if you feed the stomach nothing at all, then the microbes have got nothing to ferment. And for many people, they have to kickstart the whole thing with maybe, a fast. Sometimes you can, up to a 3-day fast is very doable. So I do a 3-day fast every spring, summer, autumn, winter. And then in the day, I time restrict eating and maybe have 1 meal a week. So time restricted eating is also additionally helpful. But again, the rules are the sicker you are, the slower you go. So how long do you have to do this? And the answer is you do it for life. Because as soon as you go back to your wicked ways of ultra processed foods and white bread and stuff, you will start fermenting all over again. So, and guess what? If greedy me settled down and ate, a pound of grapes, I would probably have a fermenting gut, because that volume of food, all that sugar and yeast, and I would burp. That's often a sign that, I've got an upper fermenting gut. So it's a very dynamic thing. And guess what? Primitive man, he would have had an upper fermenting gut for a brief window of time in the autumn. But of course, you can deal with it for a short window of time. And if that's the price of getting fat for survival for the winter, then it's a good payoff, isn't it? So the PK diet is the evolutionary correct diet that we should all be doing for life in order to live life to our full potential. And I'll give you an example there. Shut me up if you told this story. But I used to look after an old boy. He was a friend of mine, Tony. He wrote a fantastic book about his exploits in the Navy during the Second World War. And he used to run the odd dinner party. And when he was aged 95, I could see he was struggling a little bit. So I said, why don't you come and live in my granny flat? So yes, he said he'd like to do that very much. So of course, I fed him a PK diet and jabbed up with B12 and gave him vitamins, minerals and all that stuff. And he died last October, aged 102. And when he died, he had all his faculties about him. He's a great raconteur. He remembered every detail of what had gone on in the war. His brain was as sharp as a tack. No cancer, no heart disease. He just ran out of energy, I think. But he just died in his sleep. But the point is that's how I want to live my life. I want to live it to its full potential, with my brain functioning well, with my body working well, because I like doing things. And then, one day I'll just drop off my perch like that. That's how we should all die. A good life, and then drop. And what's happening at the moment? People are getting symptoms, getting pathology mainly because of poor quality diet, and then they get given a drug which suppresses their symptoms. And suppressing symptoms is a bad thing to do, because we have symptoms for very good reason. It tells us there's something wrong, and they just go downhill, 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 and they end up in a wheelchair and a stick in a home and go demented. It's a miserable existence. That is not for you, and it's not for me.
I agree. For somebody who is going to periodically have carbs or sugar, the upper fermenting gut can come back. You just talked about that. But once somebody decides to attack it with this protocol, how quickly does it reverse? Is it days? Is it weeks?
No, a few days. You can get rid of it. I mean, one of the upper fermenting guts is Helicobacter microbes is Helicobacter pylori. Most people know of H. pylori. We know it's the driver of stomach ulcers and duodenal ulcers and the like. And when I was writing my book, The Infection Game, I thought, I wonder if anybody's treated Helicobacter pylori with vitamin C or iodine. And I found a Polish study of, I think it was about 35, 36 people, all been diagnosed with Helicobacter pylori. And all they did was give them 5 grams of vitamin C. Now, if you'd said to me, any chance that getting rid of H. pylori, I'd say, no, it's a really tough microbe, no chance. No special diets, no iodine, no intermittent fasting, just 5 grams of vitamin C a day. And I was amazed to read that a third of them got rid of Helicobacter pylori just with 5 grams of vitamin C a day. I have to say, I was blown away with that result, because normally the treatment is at least 2, maybe 3 antibiotics and a proton pump inhibitor, and that does about 90%. But as I say, these simple interventions will get rid of some quite really nasty, aggressive little microbes in the upper gut.
I know you're not a fan of dairy, but are you familiar with Dr. William Davis and his L-reuteri yogurt? He uses a half and half to make this yogurt that fights SIBO.
Okay, well, I'm ashamed to say I'm not familiar with that work, but the point is, yogurt. The problem with dairy products is, well, first of all, the fat is fine. The safest dairy product is butter. I'm very happy for people to have as much butter as they like. But again, we look for an evolutionary explanation. And dairy products evolved for young mammals. If young mammals don't grow very quickly, they get eaten by saber-toothed tigers. So all dairy products contain growth promoters, and that's the milk protein. The milk protein is growth promoting, which is great if you're a young mammal wanting to grow, but not great if you're a mature adult not wanting to get cancer. And we know dairy products are a risk factor for breast cancer and probably prostate cancer as well. So that's the problem with milk protein. And the other problem with milk is the sugar. Now, of course, yogurt has had that sugar fermented out, so that will be a safer version of. But I'm always a bit nervous about dairy products because dairy allergy is very common. And of course, I'm dairy allergic myself, which is why I'm particularly, sensitized to that issue, perhaps. But I can get away with butter, which of course is almost pure fat. And again, studies have been done. There's a lovely paper by David Fried and Margaret Moss called The Cow and the Coronary, where they looked at incidence of heart disease throughout Europe, country by country. And essentially, the more dairy products consumed, the greater the risk of heart disease. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that the proportion of calcium and magnesium in dairy products. Now, our physiological requirements of a calcium-magnesium 1-to-1. Dairy products, it's 10 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. Now, those 2 minerals are absorbed by the same mechanism. So if you've got a lot of calcium there, you're going to malabsorb magnesium. And magnesium deficiency is pretty much pandemic. We're all magnesium deficient, almost without exception. And that, is a risk factor for hearts because you need calcium for activation. You need calcium for muscles to contract and for nerves to fire, but you need magnesium for them to relax. So magnesium is a really important part of what's called diastolic dysfunction. When the heart contracts, if it doesn't relax properly, if it's stiff, then it can't fill efficiently, and if it can't fill efficiently, then cardiac output will fall. So that stiffness, that diastolic dysfunction, is a magnesium deficiency symptom. So that's one reason. Also for dysrhythmias, if the commonest cardiac dysrhythmias are ectopic beats, when the heart throws in an extra beat, and you will be told by your cardiologist, "Oh, don't worry about that. That's common. Everybody gets those." No, it's not normal. And the commonest cause of ectopic beats would be magnesium deficiency. After that's probably caffeine, stress, food allergy, iodine deficiency, toxic stress as well. But the point is, they are not normal, and magnesium deficiency is a common cause there. I'll tell you another story.
Please.
This pertains to, I think it's 2006. It was the Great Northern Run. Now, that's a half marathon that's held annually up in the northeast. And it's held in the spring. And on this particular day, it was incredibly hot. It's a very hot day. They had 13,000 runners turn up for this half marathon, and off they set. 4 blokes dropped dead. And when they came to post-mortem, the post-mortem was normal. And they were diagnosed with, don't laugh now, sudden adult death syndrome. I mean, it's laughable, isn't it? That could be used as a diagnosis, Anyway, but the question is, why did they die? Now, as I said, we're all magnesium deficient. But when you run, you sweat a lot and you pee out a lot of magnesium. And my guess is those 4 guys were borderline magnesium deficient. And when they're running, it's a very hot day, it's towards the end of the run, they're sweating. They suddenly developed acute magnesium deficiency. So the heart contracted with calcium, but couldn't relax. There wasn't enough magnesium for it to relax. And the heart just stopped in systole. And the observation, they all just went down like that. And of course, by the time you come to post-mortem, you won't see that, will you? Because, it's days later and the heart has had a chance to go floppy again. So my guess, and it is only a guess, is they died from magnesium deficiency.
All right, Sarah, I know we're coming up on time, but a few loose ends I want to make sure we tie up.
Okay.
We've talked about upper fermenting gut, the 3 supplements that help there. You gave dosages, but I believe from our first chat, MSM is something we take periodically. Can you explain that?
Well, you can take it any way you like. So if you've got a problem, then what I would do is I'd say load up with it until you've got ahead of that game, and then reduce to a maintenance state. Now, if you're carnivore, you probably don't need it because there's lots of sulfur in meat. But if you're anything less than carnivore, or if you're poisoned, and guess what, we are all poisoned, it would be a good idea to have it, half a teaspoon a day, or, I don't remember to take half a teaspoon a day, but I do have bone broth. And when I have my cup of bone broth, I put MSM in that. So it becomes part of your normal life. And I think MSM, because we're all sulfur deficient, it is organic. It's the body's natural source, or rather life's natural source of sulfur. Then I think it's a very good thing to take.
Got it. So we can take it daily.
Of course.
And it helps with easy water. You explained that and got into what easy water is. I'll add a couple other modalities that can help structure water in the body. One being grounding and getting sunshine.
Correct. Heat is
How do
really
you feel about, and heat? Talk about that.
Well, for good quality exclusion zone water, in fact, this is a real mystery to Gerald Pollack, because he could see in his experiments that this exclusion zone water was being formed, that membranes were becoming charged, so much so that he could put an electrode in the membrane, an electrode in the water, and light a light up. Now, as we know, as we say in this country in Yorkshire, you don't get out for nout, you don't get something for nothing. And he was saying, where is this energy coming from that allows this EZ water to form? And through just a bit of luck, he realised it was the background temperature that was critical. So for EZ water to form, we've got to have external radiation. And any radiation will do. Even electromagnetic radiation from the stars does something. So you can put exclusion zone water in a very cold environment, sealed up, and you will still get some EZ water forming. And that's probably safe from the stars. But we know that the most efficient is far infrared heat. And far infrared heat at, guess what, body temperature of 37 degrees gives us the best quality EZ water. Now, obviously, if we're running nice and warm because we're healthy, we make it from our muscles, just the business of living. No engine is 100% efficient, and mitochondria are not 100% efficient, and some energy will be lost as heat. But of course, sunshine is free heat, isn't it? It's free far infrared. And that's why we all feel so good in sunshine, because the far infrared light penetrates our skin by some centimetres and massively improves EZ water in our bloodstream. So it improves the circulation of the blood. It warms up our muscles, so our muscles work better. It reduces friction in the tissues, so it gets rid of our aches and pains. It's helpful in a multiplicity of ways through its action on EZ water. So heat, far infrared, is incredibly helpful.
Okay, we're going to end on this. You've made it clear we're all poisoned in the modern world. MSM helps with heavy metals, but let's get into other detox protocols, modalities that can go along with the MSM to help keep the body as toxin-free as possible.
Well, the one we haven't talked about at length is the heating regimes. So we have a lot of toxins that dump in our fat. And I know that because I've done fat biopsies and we can see them there. As I say, I've never seen a normal result. And we can get rid of those through heating regimes, because when you warm up the fat, then you literally boil off these molecules onto the lipid layer on the surface of the skin, and from whence they can be washed off. Now, we know this from a study done by Bill Ray. Now, Bill Ray was a cardiothoracic surgeon working in the 1970s, and in those days, the anaesthetic gases weren't scavenged. And he got poisoned by anaesthetic gases, and that switched on a multiple chemical sensitivity. So sensitivity to chemicals often follows a poisoning. And he set up in Dallas, in Texas, the environmental center there for people with multiple chemical sensitivity. And he realized that he had to reduce their toxic load. So he did blood tests of toxicity on 210 patients. And then he put them through this detox regime that involved heating regimes, massage, physical massage to mobilize the toxins in the fat, and then it's washing off. And then again, heating regimes, massage, and washing off. And what was so interesting after 210 patients is 200 initially got a healing crisis. Initially, 200 of those patients got worse. But then as the regimes continued, the majority of patients got better, the levels in the blood came down, and they were detoxing effectively. I've repeated those tests by doing fat biopsies before and after and confirm those results. But I think you can enhance those results by putting clean oils onto your skin. So I've got a detox cream I use, which anybody can make up. There's no secret recipes, just organic coconut oil, which I blend with organic shea butter. Now I put in a bit of extra vitamin C and a vitamin D, but that's not essential. Cover your skin with that. It's a little bit like oil pulling in the mouth. Cover your skin with that. And the dead cells on the surface of the skin will soak up that clean organic oil. The toxins in your own dirty subcutaneous fat will diffuse into those clean oils, which will then be shed with skin cells, because we shed about 3.5 kilograms of skin cells a year. So the skin itself will shed it. Or next time you have a shower or bath, then you will just wash it off. And again, I think we should all be doing that, because I know we're all poisoned. And everybody can do this. If you just put coconut oil on your skin, shea butter, it's got to be organic, nice clean oil. Remember, you shouldn't put nothing on your skin that you're not prepared to eat, because it gets absorbed. And you look at some of the skin creams, they've got horrible, ingredients in them. Stuff I certainly wouldn't eat, but people put it on their skin because it kind of smells nice and feels nice. But they're probably poisoning themselves in the process. So it's got to be organic, clean oils, and that will help the process even further.
All right, Sarah, we're going to leave it there for today. Really enjoyed round 2. Lots of great information. We're going to link up your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. You're a good person to talk to.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
The upper fermenting gut is a major, major problem. It goes almost unrecognized by the conventional doctors. We have to get rid of the upper fermenting gut. And yes, there's a two-pronged approach. Yes, we starve them out with a low-carb ketogenic diet. And second,